All right, everyone. Hello, my name is Adam Buckmeyer, and today I'm going to be talking to you about cradle-to-grave disposal of hazardous waste. So now you may be asking yourself, what defines hazardous waste? And the EPA has said that is any waste that poses risks to the environment or to humans. So this could be drain cleaner that you have in your cabinet or pesticides that are used in an industrial crop farm. And cradle-to-grave, in respect to hazardous waste, refers to tracking the hazardous waste from the moment it is created to when it is stored and disposed of finally. This was brought into place by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which was enacted in 1976 by the 94th U.S. Congress under President Gerald Ford. This was the first statutes and amendments that the government had put into place to deal with the disposal of hazardous waste, and it was a framework for dealing with waste control overall, which has not been done before this point. So RCRA is required at any facilities where hazardous waste is treated, stored, or disposed according to the EPA. So those places must have a hazardous waste permit. So the drain cleaner I mentioned earlier that you may have in your cabinet, the factory that it was produced in certainly has to have a RCRA hazardous waste permit to deal with the waste that they generate in the process. So why is RCRA so important? Well, in the 1940s, Hooker Chemical Company moved into Love Canal, which is a neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, and they began to dump all of their hazardous byproducts into the canal, which everyone thought was fine at first. I mean, there was some opposition in the community, but there weren't any effects that they immediately saw. But then flash forward to the 1970s, and people start to have some weird health issues. There's a high rate of miscarriages. A lot of people have raised white blood cell counts, which led to a lot of cases of leukemia and other cancers, among other minor issues like chemical burns or rashes. And scientists discovered that this was because rainwater had been leaching the hazardous chemicals that were in the canal, which had been closed since 1953 and was filled in with earth. So these chemicals were leaching out of the filled-in canal into the groundwater, and people were either drinking it or it was getting into crops or vegetation, disrupting the soil. So people started to take note of that, and a lot of activism surrounded this event. And eventually, President Jimmy Carter in 1978 issued the first state of emergency, which was the first step in cleaning up and remediating the site. By 1982, all of the families were evacuated, the homes were demolished, and they began the first Superfund cleanup site. So, to talk about Superfund cleanup sites, we need to talk about the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which I know is a mouthful, so we're just going to call it CERCLA. So this was enacted shortly after the state of emergencies, which was December 11th, 1980, and this was in response to Love Canal and another disaster with hazardous waste that was occurring around the same time. So this designated Superfund sites, as I mentioned, which were cleanup sites for the contamination waste. So Superfund, as I just mentioned, is where the EPA goes in and designates these sites to clean up hazardous waste. As you can see here, these are all the sites in the US. All the red ones are the ones that are on the final national priorities list, which is what the EPA designates the sites as. And then all the ones in yellow are proposed to be put onto the national priorities list. And then green are mostly cleaned and some that were just abandoned and did not go forward with the Superfund sites. So at these Superfund sites, there are two main response actions that can be taken. There are short-term ones, so in a disaster like Love Canal where there's immediate public health concern, this would be more applicable because it needs to be dealt with right then and there. Whereas long-term response actions are for things that aren't necessarily posing an immediate threat and they can take years or even decades to clean up. So now that we know all the basics, I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of cradle-to-grave disposal. So obviously it regulates the life cycle of hazardous waste from the minute it is created to the minute it is stored and put away forever. And indirectly because of this, it'll protect the health of humans and the environment because there's less room for error in treating and storing and disposing of hazardous waste. And it also will prevent disasters like Love Canal. this was a child around when the activism started, before the state of emergencies, and he was asking for some help. So that was pretty sad. Yeah. Now there is one major shortcoming to cradle-to-grave disposal, and that is that it does not deal with the mitigation, or it doesn't deal with the reduction of hazardous waste, rather it deals with just the mitigation of it. And I think that a perfect solution to dealing with hazardous waste in general should deal with the reduction as well as the cradle-to-grave. So there are some chemicals that can be generated from hazardous waste that are persistent in the environment essentially forever. And these are known as persistent organic pollutants. And we have industrial chemicals, chemical byproducts, and pesticides. Some of the most infamous being DDT and PCBs. We've heard the horror stories of those before, I'm sure. But to talk about another type of waste management practice, there is cradle-to-cradle. And while it is not applicable to all hazardous waste, it is a step in the right direction. It focuses on, instead of having the loop that starts at one point and ends at one point, it's a closed loop that focuses on reusing products where we can, and even some hazardous waste can be put to better use rather than being stored and disposed of. So, for example, detergents, some of them can be considered hazardous waste, and if you were to throw them away with a bag of just regular municipal solid waste, then the entire bag would be treated as hazardous waste. But there is a way to produce biodegradable detergents that can be composted. It just then becomes a question of if it's economically viable for the production company. Also, typical products like tires or even shoes that have rubber in them, they can be composted and recovered of their rubber to be used in other things. Like, I know some tracks at schools have been made from old rubber shoes and things like that. And then also there is recycling electronics. So electronics can be dismantled and their parts can be reused to essentially make other electronics. And electronics are hazardous waste. E-waste is hazardous waste. So this is a way that you can kind of combine the cradle-to-grave aspect with the cradle-to-cradle and deal with hazardous waste in a way that it's not being used and then just disposed of immediately. So to conclude this, I would like to mention that cradle-to-grave is not perfect, but that by no means makes it a bad thing. It's certainly, RCRA and CERCLA were very monumental for environmental policy, as they were the first national framework for dealing with this waste. And with research and more technology and time, we can figure out more waste management practices, but that will just have to depend on the future. But all in all, cradle-to-grave does function to keep the environment and humans safe, so I don't think that's a bad thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.